Monetary unit or dollar unit sampling represents a different approach to auditing. Rather than looking at a control in a yes-no sense, we're looking at, is an account fairly stated? But an account is really just a collection of dollars. Under monetary unit sampling, what we're going to do is we're going to identify particular dollars and we're going to audit those dollars. The process is kind of a 4 or 5 step process. First, we're going to determine our sample size. Then we're going to divide all the dollars in the account. So the millions of dollars in the account, we're going to divide them into equal buckets. We're going to find the particular account that each of our dollars we're going to audit is found in. And then whatever we find about that account, we're going to say that the whole bucket or that interval, using the sampling terminology, looks like that. So if we audit a $10 million account and we break into 10 buckets and we find a $1 error in an account, and that account should be a $1 and it's 0, it's 100% wrong. We would say the entire interval is wrong. It's a unique approach which allows us to look at small items and reach conclusions. And so let's walk through the steps in more detail. But that's the overview of how we're going to tackle this. So first thing is we're going to have to identify our sample size. We're going to do it the exact same way we do it under attribute sampling. We're going to look at the tolerable rate, the estimated misstatements, and the desired confidence. So we're going to use the same tables that we've used before to calculate that. And so we're going to be looking at dollar amounts and not rates. So we're not going to be reaching a conclusion that we found an upper deviation rate. We're going to find an upper misstatement limit. So for that reason, it's used for mainly assets, but it can be used for liabilities. There's a lot of advantages and disadvantages, and that list is provided for you on Canvas as well. But essentially, it's great for testing overstatement because it's a probability proportionate to size methodology, meaning larger accounts are more likely to be selected. So if the client overstates an account, that actually increases the chance that it will be selected and audited. And so let's look at an example to see if this helps us. So imagine we had that $3 million account and we're not using monetary unit sampling, we're just doing a very naive approach. We pick $100,000 in items, we audit them, we find $98,000 are correctly stated, so we have a $2,000 error. We would say we have a $60,000 error. And in this case, if we can only tolerate $50,000 in error, it's pretty simple. But we don't have any sampling on this. We're not being scientific. We're using a non-statistical methodology with this approach. But once we bring our methodology and we define the risk of incorrect misstatements, we define the material misstatement, we define our expected misstatements based on our professional judgment. No, we're not leaving professional judgment when we use statistics. We're just not using it to select the sample size. We're using it to determine, assess the inputs to sample size. So our known misstatements are whatever we client says the balance is versus what we say it. What we say it is based on our audit results. Projected misstatements are the amount we think the entire interval will have. So for example, if we have a $1 million interval, we audit a $50,000 account and we find it's only worth $20,000. So we find $30,000 in error. That's known misstatement. Client said it was 50, but it was only 20. But we would say that entire interval is 60% misstated. So there would be $600,000 in projected misstatements. The client could fix the known misstatement, but they cannot fix the projected misstatement because we don't know what other accounts would be wrong. And so we're making the assumption that the dollar we audited represents the entire interval. So whatever we find with the one account we audit, it represents the entire interval. So we just can't fix the known misstatements and ignore the projected. We can fix the known, and we have to accept that the projected are unfixable. So we're going to define our objective. We're going to get some estimates. We're going to define our population. We're going to remember we're going to be targeting individual dollars so that that dollar will be found in an account that's found in an interval. So we're identifying the dollar to identify the account to reach conclusions about the sample interval. And so it will make more sense as we do problems. A misstatement is the difference between what we find and what the client says. And so nothing new about determining the sample size. So how we actually find the account. So we're going to determine our sample interval, which means we're going to take our book value divided by our sample size. That tells us our sample interval. We're going to pick a random starting point. We're going to list all the accounts in a random or alphabetical order. It cannot be largest to smallest. We can't sort them on any criteria. In other words, it will no longer be a random test, and we're violating some of the assumptions. So we're going to list the accounts. We're going to put the balance in the first column. Then in the second column, we're going to put our running total. We're going to ask, is our random starting point, which in this case is $39.77, is the $39.77 in the first account, Ace Enterprise? No, only $1 to $23.50 are in that account. So we would not audit that. Is $39.77 in the second account, the hospital? Yes, because every dollar between $23.51 and $17,845 is in that account. $39.77 is in that account we would audit. Now the next one we're going to be looking for is $39.77 plus our sample interval, which gives us $38.59. So we're going to keep going through until we find that. It's a systematic process. It's methodical. It's not necessarily hard. And obviously, if you're doing this in Excel, you can set up some if-then conditions, and then the data will pop really easily for you. But you need to understand the theory behind it, because Excel doesn't audit, you audit. So then we're going to perform our audit procedures, meaning we're going to, now that we've identified these accounts, we're going to look, is that account fairly stated? If it's misstated, is it overstated, understated, and what's its true value? In this case, we audited 2.5 million. We said we could tolerate 125,000. We have our 93 sample intervals, and we expected 25,000 in misstatements, and our sample interval was 26,882. We found 4 errors. The first one had a book value of 21,000, and we said it was 18,609, which said there was a $3,200 difference. We would calculate the taint or tainting factor as the difference divided by the book value. So book value minus audited value divided by book value. And so we would do that for each account. Now you'll note we don't do it for the third one because there's an exception. And it's not just to make life difficult. The theory demands it, that if the book value exceeds the sample interval, we don't need to calculate a sampling interval because it would actually understate the error in the end. And so this is an important assumption that we don't do that. And so, and we'll note on the fourth one, an account is completely missing. We don't think it has any value. That's 100% tainting factor. So our next step would be to rank these in order, because we're so our largest one would be learn, then Marva, then good. And so we're going to rank them from largest to smallest. The reason is we are going to need to go through and calculate our upper misstatement limit. And we're going to be using a table. It's the projected upper misstatement table, row 100. Now the numbers vary slightly depending on the table you're drawing from, but there's certain assumptions. If you look at that table and it's in the sampling guide, if you had found 0 errors, you would have still concluded that there were 3 errors in the sample. So first we want to say, let's assume we found no errors. What would be the amount of money we need to set aside for a misstatement? And that's 3 times the sample. Now we found 1 error that was 100% misstated. So our projected misstatement is 1 times the sample interval. Now, if we read that row, we found 1 error. It told us that there were 4.75 errors. Well, we've already accounted for 3 of them, so finding 1 error leads us to believe there are an additional 1.75 errors. So 26,882 times 1.75. Because remember, we're saying whatever error was in that account, the entire interval takes a look like it, and we're saying, based on the tables, for every error that looks like that, we have 1.75 errors that look like that. The next row, we found the account was 40% off. So we believe that entire interval is 40% off. So we believe this error, which was only, so Marva, we found a $2,600 error, and we're going to project that that means there's $10,000 in that sample interval that are wrong, and an additional 1.55 errors throughout the entire sample that we missed. This is our sampling allowance. And so that's going to lead us to conclude that there's 16,000. And we go through, and at the very end, we add in the 2,500 from that exception rule. We add all those numbers up. And if you recall, our sample limit was, our tolerable limit was 125,000. So we're over it. So we've got a problem. We can't accept this result. So what we need to do is make a decision. We're going to conclude that it is not fairly stated because our upper misstatement limit exceeds our tolerable. At this stage, we have some options. We can increase sample size. That would be particularly useful since over half of our errors related to our sampling allowance. So if we were to double our sample size, we would cut our sample interval in half, which would mean we cut our base basic precision or basic sampling allowance in half. And so that would be incredibly useful at lowering it. It would have other benefits, but doubling our sample interval means we're probably going to find other errors too. So another option is we could look to do additional testing to verify through other means. We can have the client correct the known misstatements. Remember, they can't correct for sampling allowance. They can't correct for projected misstatements. They can't just create an allowance for misstatements. They can fix the known misstatements. And then if the client absolutely refused to do anything, we could talk about issuing a qualified or adverse opinion. But those are pretty extreme options to discuss. And so at the end of our process, there's three possible outcomes. We say the account is fairly stated, and it is fairly stated. We say it's not fairly stated, and it's not fairly stated. Both of those, we reach the correct outcome. Our worst case scenario is we say the account is fairly stated, but it's not actually. That means we issued the wrong audit opinion. We have said there are no problems when there are problems. This is much more significant than misdiagnosing internal controls, because internal controls, when we rely on them when we shouldn't, we increase the likelihood that we're going to miss something. This doesn't increase the likelihood that we're going to miss something. It means we have missed something. The other possibility is we say that there are problems when in fact there are not problems. This is going to undermine the efficiency of the audit because we're going to have to work with the client to fix known misstatements, expand our samples. It's going to be expensive, but it doesn't undermine the effectiveness. It's that efficiency versus effectiveness discussion. So monetary unit sampling, highest possible level. We're going to come up with a process to identify individual dollars to audit. We're going to say those dollars are in accounts. We audit those accounts. We're going to say whatever we find in that account, our entire sample interval is going to look like that. We're going to add in some sampling allowance for the likelihood we got unlucky or lucky, depending on your perspective. And we're going to add it all up and we're going to compare it to the total statement. And that's how you do monetary unit sampling.